Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched My Man Godfrey from 1936. This is back to my list of films that are known for being rather iconic and classic, and one of those, every history buff or old movie fan or cinema history buff, that is, or old movie fan knows of this and knows of this set of actors in these roles. And one I had never gotten around to watching. I think it had been suggested to me at some other point before, but it's an old movie. They're not always the easiest to get into. And not knowing a lot about it going into it, I wasn't entirely sure what to be prepared for either. But I figured it was more on the comedy spectrum, given the nature of things, and on the romantic side, since most things are from this era, at least in some regard, and given the name. But I was actually surprised how complex and interesting this movie can be. It's not perfect by any means, but it does have a variety of nuance, and I think it's a really good example of why the screwball comedy genre sort of came to be. 1936 would sort of have been the beginnings of the idea of the screwball comedy, something we've talked about in a couple of other videos before with a couple of other movies, about how screwball comedy sort of came about as a way to put both a comedic twist on things and to do some social commentary without, being too upsetting for the more traditionalists, social traditionalists, let's say. It is a genre that tends to have more commanding female characters with a bit more agency of their own, and well, it's not always flattering, especially in a modern view. It's, for the time, usually fairly progressive, comparatively speaking. And I think this is a fairly good example of that. It certainly falls into the standards of the time. They're not really saying anything really shocking by any means. The sort of traditional high-class family, standard nobility, kind of American nobility type of thing is very much in place. The roles of women are very limited, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't change the fact that, by its nature and by the nature of the events as they unfold, there's a lot more conflict and a lot more commentary about both social places and gender norms that is present in the film, at least, comparatively speaking for the time. Where it does fall apart, if I'll jump right to the end, is that the very end of the film ultimately disappoints me because it lands on a very traditional note and a joke that ultimately hits very poorly in a current era. The end of the film basically lands on a joke about how men ultimately get, by my reading at least, it's a joke about how men ultimately get told what to do by the women in their life and then captured into marriage and those sorts of things, and cycles continue, so on and so forth, which seems contrary to a lot of what the rest of the content of the film is. And I would have liked to see a bit more of an egalitarian or even like non-committal ending that would have landed a little differently. But avoiding giving explicit spoilers of how that goes, let's go back to the beginning. The setup for the movie is basically about somebody who is homeless during the Great Depression, who is plucked out of that by a noble family or I keep saying noble, what's the word I'm looking for? High society, I guess. New York, rich folks, living in mansions in New York City, that sort of thing. They are, they pluck him out as a tool for a scavenger hunt, and he doesn't take too kindly to that. And the immediate dichotomy between what might be expected of that character and his reactions, and how he actually acts towards people who would be traditionally seen as his like social betters, who he should be exceedingly polite to. That all gets turned on its head very quickly and sets up a nice sort of is tete-a-tete really the phrase I'm looking for? Maybe a back and forth, a sort of sparring match that goes on between various characters and quickly sets up the dynamics that are going to happen between those characters. It's an interesting dynamic and sets up a good amount of what the characters are like as well, without needing to explicitly develop them with exposition or too many referenced events or those sorts of things. So it sets up a lot of sort of drama and opportunities for clashes and comedy throughout the rest of the film fairly quickly. I'm actually going to say overall the weakest part of the film probably has to do with the romantic aspect. And that is functionally, just standard for almost any movie of the era, that there's going to be sort of a romantic entanglement between the male lead and some sort of female lead, comparatively speaking. And how that sorts out depends on the genre, of course. In a screwball comedy, one would probably expect that the female lead is going to be relatively like strong-minded, openly sort of somewhat rebellious, somebody who sort of offends the sensibilities of the more traditionalist characters in the film. And that is present to some extent, but I actually think it's one of the weakest parts because I don't think it goes that far. In fact, the main female lead, who I would say is Carole Lombard, really has the least overall character development of all of the three female characters, or really the only ones, but main female characters who are present. And her mother is sort of a trope, and her sister, by comparison, who, to be totally honest, I don't remember the name of. Not that I remember Carole Lombard's character's name either. Her sister has more of a character to her. She's a little bit more conniving. She's a little bit more like openly intelligent. She's sort of the foil in a way to William Powell's character as the male lead. And so the sparring match, at times I was wondering whether the romantic interests were going to get more entangled, and whether it was going to be a case of the sort of the female lead and the romantic interest switching at one point or another. It doesn't work out like that. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler to say. But ultimately, I was almost always more interested in Carole Lombard's sister's character, what was the name of her, the actor? My apologies. Alice Brady, I think? I think that's right. I think that's her sister. So Carol plays Irene, and then Alice plays Angelica. And Alice seems to be Angelica seems to be the much more with it character, who's sort of, in more of a situation of sparring with Powell's character, with Godfrey. And that makes her more compelling, more interesting, and often who's having more meaningful interactions during their screen time. Ultimately, I think Irene and Godfrey have the most screen time together because that is trying to be the focus of the movie, but they never really have much of an exchange, a meaningful exchange. At most, Godfrey really seems to sort of baby Irene. His attitude is very much, this is, a young somewhat petulant. This whole family are weirdos who don't know how to behave, don't know how to behave with other people, and certainly don't know how to behave with people who they don't give appropriate respect to. And so the relationship really never goes anywhere, to my mind. She never really gets much development. She just sort of throws a tantrum for most of the film, and that makes her less compelling, which is a shame because I actually think that her acting is quite good, and she was given some accolades for that. Another, just as a side note, a bunch of the people who are in this cast list, in particular William Powell and Carole Lombard, have fairly storied careers in Hollywood, but I don't think I've seen either of them in anything before. If I have, it certainly hasn't been on the show, and I don't think it's been in the last 10 years of anything I've watched. But I'm not 100% sure if I would necessarily recognize them either. I recognize that William Powell is a well-recognized actor. I recognize his face, and even in particular his mustache. I think he's fairly well known for the Thin Man series that he was often a part of, but I've never seen those either, and so I don't know that I've ever seen him in anything before, but I could be mistaken. So as much as I don't really like Lombard's character, she still does what's clearly very dynamic and interesting acting. And I think more than a lot of the issues that I see can be chalked up to character development issues rather than anything else, because the acting across the board from all of the characters is generally very good, both in their verbal acting, their line reads and stuff like that, as well as their physical acting, because while this isn't like slapstick or anything like that, there's a lot of physicality that goes into the acting here. And because of the nature of the cinematography, both at the time, the standards of the time, and just some very good cinematography that's going on in this film in particular, there are a lot more wide shots where you see people's full bodies. It's not a lot, not a lot of shoulder up or waist up shots like are more common these days. And so when people are moving around on a set like a stage, and you're seeing them, there's a lot more. There's a lot more about their acting that needs to be right, and everybody acts their character really well in the physicality and their facial expressions, all these different things. Oh, I forgot to mention actually that I am watching a remastered but black and white version of the film. This was apparently given a colorization treatment in the 2000s. I've talked before about how I think those are terrible and shouldn't be done. Just don't do them. But in the 90s and 2000s, there were a lot of old movies that were owned by it was basically a way, just soapbox for half a second here, it was basically a way for a lot of the ownership companies to get around the fact that the copyrights were lapsing on the things they owned, because by transforming them transforming, air quotes, by adding color to them, it ostensibly allowed them to skirt the copyright law and extend the copyright on these things. I don't think that's actually the case here, because I think the copyright actually lapsed on it before that was done. But that's neither here nor there. Don't colorize black and white films. They were shot in black and white on purpose. And definitely don't do it with AI. Anyway, off soapbox. So one of the things that really stands out to me as I was talking about, the dialogue and the acting there, is that the writing is really, really solid. It's definitely raises some questions right off the bat, because Godfrey sort of comes off as a little bit more formal and a little bit more practiced in the ways of high society than you would expect to be in a condition where this is not a completely unique story by any means. And so, dragging some guy out of homelessness to come, have social interactions with high society people, that's nothing new. But for him to engage with it so well, be clearly intelligent and well-spoken and all these things, definitely raises sort of flags immediately. And it's not clear whether that's deliberate or that was, the nature of just the writing of the condition, or what exactly was going on. But it plays well and gives some more intrigue to the whole situation. You certainly get the idea that at the very least they're trying to say something about how these high society folks are not particularly intelligent or well-reasoned or even well-mannered, and by comparison, this guy who was living in a dump by the river is, better than them, basically, in many regards. It's not a aggressive social commentary, but it's certainly a little bit scathing in terms of saying, especially for the time, 1936 being right in the middle of the Great Depression, when a lot of people have been suffering for a long time, to say, like, these high society folks are not better people. They really have no awareness of what's going on for the people below them. And it's not going so far as to, try and say that they should somehow be ashamed of that or indicate social change or something like that. But it gives some idea of, a criticism there. What's additionally interesting is that, and I'm going to try and say this without spoiling the plot beats so much, it simultaneously has a sort of social welfare commentary about how those who are in positions of power should use their wealth and savings in an effort to better society, because it's the right thing to do. And also, you never know who's going to need when you're going to be the one who needs help, that sort of thing. But at the same time, it certainly rings that same story. It's not even a contradictory aspect. These are one and the same. It simultaneously rings of the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps mythology that a lot of American mythology is really based on, the idea of the American dream, that all you got to do is get a job and then you can, make money and then you can become the best person ever or whatever. And so there is definitely a mythology there, and a sort of an economic falsehood, let's say, a big economic falsehood there about what it really takes to transform yourself and transform your economic situation. And it is funny because, for being a movie that's now 89 years old, very little has changed. And in fact, a lot of things have gotten worse in some regards, and at least with regard to people's economic situations and the problems that we have socially and economically around stratification between, the richest of us and the poorest. And so to see a commentary that rings in many ways just as true, if a little bit trite, now as it did back then, is interesting, but also a little bit alarming, if we're totally honest. Mostly because having to treat the same social ills for not just 89 years, but much longer than that, is a concern. But again, I'll get off my soapbox on that in particular. I already sort of mentioned it, but I think that the cinematography really stands out in this film. I really like the camera work that's being done. I like the use of the sets. They've got some really nice sets that give sort of a good idea of different interior parts of this house that is the main setting of the film, how different people live, how different people's rooms are dressed and lit, and what the sort of how these people comport themselves, as well as things like their costuming, and every scene, most characters are wearing a different costume, and what it says about them as a person, their mental attitude in the scene, all those sorts of things. So there's some really great costuming, some really great sets, and it's all used really well by the actors as part of their physical acting as well. So, that all is sort of leads back to the idea of the movies being this multimedia feast for the eyes of a lot of different artistry coming together into one thing. And so that does stick out. The music and the audio in general is pretty good as well. I wouldn't say it's like really, really stand out, but it's definitely solid. There's actually the opening theme. I meant to check this, but the opening theme for the movie during the credits, which this being an old film, they run at the beginning. I didn't actually check what the song is, but it sounds very familiar, and I don't know if it's just a very similar song to something well known, or if it's actually well known. I didn't see in skimming that it was listed, so I'm gonna guess it was just similar. Generally speaking, I think this film is really well produced. I think that there's a lot of good acting, a lot of good writing, good performances, and good cinematography, and it all comes together really well. But ultimately, like I was alluding to at the beginning, it kind of falls flat because of issues with this core idea about the romance and the relationship. If you wanted to sort of change what I don't think this would require like a significant twist on the genre or a significant rewrite either. I really think the fix is just to have a little bit more focus on Godfrey as a character. He is a character who has agency, but it's mostly behind the scenes. It's mostly revealed after things have already happened, those sorts of things. And so having the mostly female cast have most of the agency, rather than having them use that to, direct all their actions at the male lead, having a little bit more character development of their own, having a little bit more like situational realizations and stuff like that. Those are the things I would like to see expanded a little more, in favor of sort of not dropping the romantic aspect, but at least having it come to a certain conclusion at the end, rather than saying, and it all worked out in a romantic way that feels kind of cheap. Just, it doesn't ring right to me. And unfortunately, I can't go back in time to, have a full understanding of whether that would have been a little bit more. I can certainly say, like, I think the sort of, oh, you always get roped into marriage is a very old-timey kind of viewpoint that would have been more standard for the time and rings extra icky in the current era. But whether or not that is what people would have liked and wanted for the ending at the time, I don't know. Would have liked to understand that. Is there anything in particular else I want to talk about on this? I don't think so. I think it's a really solid film. I understand why it's historically lauded as being really solid. I don't think it's one of my favorite films from the era, but you could certainly watch much worse. This is a very good film by all accounts, and it's right in that like awkward time period where we talked about the Hays Code previously and stuff like that. The movies are going through a bunch of awkward transitional periods. We're not that far into the talkies era even. The Hays Code is coming into effect. The first color movies are not that far out as well. There's some changes that are on the horizon about how the studios are organized and those sorts of things, where this would have been very much a time where actors were signed to particular studios for extended years and basically worked on whatever they were told to. And so that may be also one of the reasons why I haven't seen a lot of these actors in a lot of things, is basically if a movie wasn't produced by a certain studio, you wouldn't have seen them in some other studio's movies. That said, I did see some note in skimming the information about it that this was actually a movie where they had to trade a lot of actors' work between studios, so I don't totally know what went on there. That's a whole other exploration about what exactly the studio system was like in the 30s and that sort of thing, and how it evolved out of that later, because they also owned the theaters. But anyway, I'll stop digressing on that subject. I think this is a pretty solid movie. It's not perfect by any means, and it's certainly not, it has the usual aging problems for a movie that's as old as it is, but I like it. It's pretty good. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.